He didn't even look at me when he said it. We're terminating you effective immediately. Security will escort you out. His voice was flat, mechanical, the kind of tone someone uses when they're reading instructions off a teleprompter and praying they don't mess up a single syllable. Bradley Patterson Jr. kept his eyes glued to the glowing screen of his MacBook Pro, pretending he was too busy or too important to acknowledge the man standing 3 feet in front of him. The kid was still logged into his first day as CEO. I was 55, a man who'd taught him how to read a balance sheet back when he thought a P&L was a kind of sandwich. Watching him try to end my career with a line he didn't write and barely understood. And before we go any deeper, tell me this, where are you watching from right now? There was no handshake, no explanation, no conversation about my 28 years in the company or the deals I'd rescued or the warehouse disaster I'd prevented or the contracts I'd personally delivered during snowstorms when half the staff couldn't even get out of their driveway. Just a trembling HR rep standing behind him, clutching a folder like she was watching someone defuse a bomb with a butter knife, terrified she might be the next casualty of whatever corporate theater was playing out in this glass office. The ink on his promotion paperwork was probably still drying, yet here he was, freshly installed, freshly decorated, already playing executioner like he'd been waiting his whole life to sit in a leather chair and swing a hatchet at the closest neck. He had the whole billionaire son starter kit going. Designer haircut, navy blazer that still had the tailor's chalk marks on it, a Stanford MBA diploma framed so aggressively it was practically screaming at anyone who walked into the room. Even the way he held his tablet looked rehearsed, like someone had coached him on it. And honestly, they probably had. His father, an expensive consultant, a mirror in his corner office bathroom, someone had told him he needed to project authority. So he avoided eye contact, squared his shoulders, and read the termination line word for word, praying he wouldn't stumble. This was the moment he thought would define him, his big first decision, his flex, his statement to the board that he was decisive and bold. Kids like him always think that firing someone is how you prove you're a leader. I didn't flinch. I didn't argue. I didn't give him the satisfaction of even a raised eyebrow. I simply stood up, adjusted my jacket, a habit left over from my Navy days, and removed my badge with the kind of calm that grows from knowing you've survived far worse storms than a boy trying on power for the first time. 28 years in logistics teaches you patience. 6 years in the Navy teaches you composure. He had neither. He thought he was firing me. Thought this was his big move to modernize Anchor Point logistics, to cut out old thinking, to show the board he wasn't afraid to shake things up. As if I hadn't seen 1,000 versions of him over the years. New hires who spoke in slogans, consultants who talked in circles, executives who inherited titles instead of earning them, people who believed a fancy resume made them bulletproof. I looked him right in the eye, not with anger, but with the kind of calm confidence that makes someone realize they didn't think this moment through. I want to do this right, I said quietly. Tell your father the board meeting in 3 hours should be interesting. It took him a few seconds to process that. The HR rep looked like she'd swallowed her tongue. The security guard, who'd been summoned like backup for a hostage negotiation, shifted awkwardly, as if he wasn't sure whether to take me out or bring me snacks. I walked out without a single raised voice behind me, down the hallway, past the HR rep who couldn't make eye contact, past the guard who looked more confused than concerned, past the framed photo on the lobby wall showing the founding team. That photo had been hanging there since 1996. It showed me standing right next to Bradley Patterson Sr. on the day we opened our Chicago headquarters, back when Anchor Point Logistics was 3 folding tables, a whiteboard, and dreams bigger than our budget, back when people earned their jobs instead of inheriting them. Funny how time changes everything, except the truth. And hey, since you're here with me in this mess, let me be straight with you. If this already feels like the kind of corporate chaos that makes your blood boil or makes you shake your head because you know this story all too well, do me a small favor. Tap subscribe and hit like. Not because I need a pity click, Because it genuinely helps us bring more of these real stories out from behind those glass doors most people never see. You'd be surprised how often the person getting fired is holding far more cards than the person doing the firing. Now, let's get back to this takedown. 3 hours. That was the clock ticking over Bradley's head. 3 hours between his first firing and his first legal nightmare. 3 hours where he was probably celebrating, maybe posting on LinkedIn about tough decisions and leadership or driving innovation through structural change. He might have even thrown in some hashtags for flair, leadership, innovation, next gen, or whatever buzzwords his personal brand handler fed him that morning. Meanwhile, the board packet had already gone out. Section 12B, Emergency Succession Protocol. A clause buried so deep in the original shareholder agreement that most people who signed it probably didn't even read it, but I did. I wrote it, reviewed by legal, approved by every investor who thought it would never matter, filed cleanly with the state, a clause designed for exactly one scenario. Happens if leadership goes completely off the rails. Because sometimes it does. Sometimes a founder hands the keys to someone who thinks authority is a toy. Sometimes a new executive thinks firing people earns respect. Sometimes an entitled heir tries to run a company like it's a college group project. So Section 12AB answers that question clearly. If an executive with no equity stake terminates a founding member without a board vote, all interim authority is suspended immediately. In the voting power, it defaults to the majority shareholder, not the kid with the new office, not the heir with brand new veneers, not the CEO with 0 shares. Me, the man who quietly accumulated equity for almost 3 decades, one negotiation at a time while everyone else was busy giving speeches and printing brochures. Bradley Jr. thought he'd fired me. He had no idea he just activated the legal trapdoor I installed 13 years earlier for exactly this kind of stupidity. And the best part, he wouldn't even know it until the board meeting started. As while he was rehearsing his victory smile, I was delivering certified notices to every member of the board, every investor, every general counsel tied to Anchor Point Logistics. Not an email, not a Slack message, certified, time-stamped, return receipt envelopes. And he thought it would go quietly. He didn't know that I never built my position at this company to be visible. I built it to be bulletproof. People like Bradley Jr. always assume power sits in the chair or in the title or in the press release announcing their promotion. They think leadership is something you inherit with a key card and a corner office. They don't understand that real power, the kind that shapes companies and survives boardroom coups, is built slowly, quietly, piece by piece. In negotiations, nobody remembers, and contracts, nobody reads. The flashy executives get their pictures taken. People like me get the signatures that actually matter. My ownership didn't come from some dramatic deal or lottery moment. It wasn't handed to me. It wasn't gifted by a grateful founder. It was built one fraction of a percentage at a time over decades in rooms where the walls were beige and the coffee was burnt. And the only people who knew what was really happening were the ones who understood that leverage doesn't scream, it whispers. It shows up in the margins of contracts. It sits in clauses that look boring until the day they aren't. My first piece of equity came in year 2, back when Anchor Point Logistics didn't even have a real name yet. We were operating under 3 different LLCs because nobody could agree on branding. We had 4 clients, 2 working forklifts, and a founder who had a visionary mind, but the organizational skills of a distracted raccoon. I remember the exact afternoon it happened. We were sitting in a cramped shared office space above a tire shop trying to renegotiate a vendor contract after we accidentally sent a shipment to the wrong city. I fixed the mess, secured the contract extension, and kept us from losing our biggest client over a clerical error. When I handed Bradley Sr. the updated terms, he smiled and said, "You just saved us 6 months of revenue. Name your reward." Most people ask for a raise, maybe a bonus, something shiny today that disappears tomorrow. I asked for 0.5%. He laughed at first, then he realized I wasn't joking. He gave it to me because he didn't think it would ever matter. Back then, Anchor Point wasn't a $450 million zero cents logistics empire. It was five guys in mismatched chairs trying not to go bankrupt before lunch. 0.5% felt like a souvenir, like the company equivalent of getting your name written on a brick outside a stadium. But equity compounds, control compounds, influence compounds, and people stop paying attention when you're not the one in the spotlight. By year 7, after I'd secured our first major distribution contract, renegotiated our warehouse lease, modernized our tracking systems, and put out more fires than our insurance carrier could count, I asked for more, not loudly, not in a confrontation, just after delivering the quarterly numbers that kept us alive. I told him I didn't want a title upgrade or a bigger office. I wanted another 2%. He gave me 3. That became a pattern. Every crisis, every major win, every moment where the company could have fallen apart but didn't, my compensation wasn't applause or a plaque on a wall. It was equity. At first, tiny fractions, then meaningful percentages. People thought I was odd for turning down bonuses. They didn't realize bonuses disappear, equity grows teeth. By year 15, I held 35% of the company. And that was before the real opportunities arrived. The CFO meltdown was the first big one. He was brilliant but volatile, the kind of guy who could navigate a $6 million budget blindfolded, but couldn't navigate his own marriage. When the divorce papers hit him like a freight train and the lawyers started circling like sharks sniffing blood, he needed cash fast. His equity stake was his biggest asset, and he was desperate enough to sell it at a discount that should have been illegal. I didn't take advantage of him. I simply made him an offer that solved both our problems. He signed the transfer papers with tears in his eyes. 15% moved into my hands before the board even processed the resignation. Then came the lawsuit from one of the founder's brothers, a man who had a talent for inventing problems where none existed. He claimed we'd infringed on a patent he had banded years earlier. We fought it, he lost, and afterward, he wanted out. He wanted money more than pride. He wanted silence more than fairness, and he wanted it quickly. So I gave him exactly that. An NDA strong enough to quiet an earthquake, and a payout that looked generous on paper but was still far below market value. The shares, 22%. Mine now, 72. No fanfare, no announcements, no victory laps, just a quiet update filed properly with the Delaware Secretary of State. If anyone bothered to look, they would have seen my name attached to a controlling interest large enough to shift gravity. But nobody bothered. They were too busy arguing about marketing budgets or debating whether to update the mission statement. Control hides well in plain sight. And tucked inside that control was Section 12B, the little clause I wrote after Junior's cousin tried to fire half our warehouse staff during a tantrum that started because his digital transformation proposal had been rejected. He didn't understand budgeting, labor laws, HR policy, or even what a supply chain actually was. He just knew a firing spree would make him look bold. Stopped it. But the incident made me realize something. If one unqualified relative could get too close to authority, another eventually would. So I wrote Section 12B, disguised it inside a routine contract update, and had it approved during a board meeting where everyone was too focused on the upcoming holiday shipment rush to question the fine print. It was a safeguard, a last resort parachute, a detonator with my initials engraved on it. And the beauty of it, nobody remembered it existed. Not the board, not legal, and not the founder, and absolutely not his son. People forget the quiet ones. They underestimate the ones who don't brag. They ignore the ones who aren't chasing titles or walking around with a clipboard trying to look busy. They forget the person who built the foundation because they're too busy admiring the chandelier. But chandeliers fall. Foundations don't. So while Junior strutted into my office, believing the badge on his chest made him king, he didn't realize he was stepping onto a pressure plate that had been waiting for someone with his exact level of entitlement. A trap designed for incompetence, wrapped in confidence. And when he fired me, he didn't weaken my position. He strengthened it. He validated the trigger, activated the clause. and handed me the legal equivalent of a missile launcher. Everything I sent that morning before he ever walked into my office had been time-stamped and notarized. The activation letter, the shareholder statement, the equity breakdown, the historical approvals, the archived agreements. The packet was complete, airtight, and waiting like a storm cloud ready to burst. He thought he was firing an employee. He didn't know he was making the majority shareholder the most dangerous version of himself he could possibly awaken. And as he celebrated his imaginary victory, the board members were opening the packet that would freeze his authority like a dead battery in a winter storm. He was celebrating, they were panicking, and I was waiting. The thing about legal mechanisms like Section 12EB is that they don't explode the moment they're triggered. They seep into the building like a slow pressure change, the kind that starts as a strange feeling in the air before anyone has the courage to ask what's happening. It begins quietly with a glance between coworkers, then a whisper outside a conference room, then a phone call delivered with an edge in the voice, and soon the whole office can feel that something big has shifted, even if nobody knows the details yet. Downstairs in legal, that shift hit like a cold wind. The packet I sent wasn't dramatic or theatrical, no bright red warnings or bold threats, just clean, precise documentation arranged by someone who understood exactly how to collapse a faulty power structure using nothing but a single clause and perfect timing. The title alone, Section 12B Activation Shareholder Transition Proposal, made the general counsel pause mid-breath, the way a person goes still when they realize the situation is far more serious than it looks. He didn't skim, he didn't delegate, he read every word, and as he moved down each page, his expression went flat, professional, and deeply concerned. This wasn't a misunderstanding or an internal disagreement. This was a legal landmine, and the CEO's son had stepped on it with the confidence of a man who didn't know he was walking through a minefield. The attorneys started flipping pages with the urgency of people watching a slow-motion disaster. Assistants brought printed copies because nobody trusted reading something this critical on a screen. Someone muttered about fiduciary liability. Someone else whispered about SEC implications. Another pointed out that Bradley Jr. held no equity stake, and when the phrase unauthorized termination of a founding member hit the table, the room felt like it had lost half its oxygen. Upstairs, meanwhile, Bradley Patterson Jr. was completely unaware. He sat in his all-glass office, legs crossed, probably sipping a cold brew, drafting a company-wide email he believed would be his strong leadership moment. He sprinkled in phrases like long-term vision and modernization, proud of how important they sounded. He leaned back in his leather chair, staring at the skyline like he was the star of his own corporate movie, never realizing the scene was already turning into a courtroom drama. Across the city, board members were opening their own packets in office towers, home libraries, and airport lounges. Some were in meetings, some were traveling, one was golfing, but the moment the words immediate suspension of executive authority appeared in front of them, their faces changed. Lunches were canceled, calls were paused. Assistants were told to hold everything. Suddenly, people who hadn't read a shareholder clause in years were diving back into the bylaws like they were exam notes before a final they forgot they had. A group chat formed almost instantly. Is this real? When did this start? Who triggered this? Does the CEO know what he did? They all knew the answer to the last question. Of course he didn't. He wasn't capable of understanding the size of the mistake he'd made. Inside the building, you could feel the tension spreading. Offices have instincts. Employees notice when doors close too quickly, when HR avoids eye contact, when executives walk faster, gripping their phones like lifelines. By early afternoon, the legal team had flagged Junior's termination memo. It was sloppy, missing signatures, written like a college group project, and time-stamped in a way that practically confessed wrongdoing. When the attorneys saw that my activation letter had been filed hours earlier with perfect documentation, one of them swore under his breath. The general counsel finally said the sentence that locked everything in place. He triggered it. No explanation needed. No confusion. Everyone in that department knew exactly who he was. Upstairs, in his glass cage, Junior continued typing, still convinced he had just reshaped the company for the better. He had no idea he was writing an email that would never be sent, an email that would never see daylight, because by the time he hit his dramatic closing line, the board was already shifting into emergency mode. And miles away on a golf course, Bradley Patterson Sr. ignored 5 phone calls that could have saved him a world of pain. Golf was his therapy, his sanctuary, his place to disconnect. The 6th call, though, the one he finally answered, was from his general counsel. Not a text, not a voicemail, a direct call with urgency in every breath. That was the moment the founder of the company realized something catastrophic had happened. While the board scrambled and legal tightened their grip on the situation, and the founder raced toward downtown Chicago still wearing his golf cleats, I wasn't pacing or stressing. I wasn't rewriting plans or panicking over outcomes. I was sitting at my kitchen counter, suit jacket still on, sipping a black coffee and watching the time. There's a special kind of peace that comes from knowing every piece of your plan is falling exactly where you placed it years ago. And this wasn't revenge, it wasn't anger, it wasn't personal. This was structure, this was architecture. This was the quiet weight of a system doing exactly what it was designed to do when arrogance collided with paperwork. People like Junior mistake power for authority. Power is loud, attention-seeking, and fragile. Authority is quiet, patient, and permanent. Power fires someone on day one. Authority waits in the contract, fully loaded, fully legal, and fully capable of collapsing the entire building when the wrong person grabs the wrong lever. He believed firing me proved something. What it proved was that he didn't understand the battlefield he'd walked into. He had the sword, so, but I owned the battlefield. And while he spun around in his chair, blissfully unaware that the ground beneath him had already cracked, the difference between us had never been clearer. When the founder finally picked up his phone on the 6th call, the general counsel didn't waste time easing him in or softening the blow. There's a tone lawyers use when something is no longer a question, no longer salvageable, no longer debatable. And the moment he heard it, Bradley Patterson Sr. stopped mid-stride on the fairway. The sun was still bright, the grass was perfect, the air smelled like cut turf and cigar smoke. But none of that mattered anymore because his general counsel was saying words no CEO, no founder, no parent ever expects to hear in the same sentence. Your son signed something he shouldn't have. And then, quieter, sharper, you need to get to headquarters immediately. He didn't argue. He didn't ask for details. He didn't demand explanations. He just grabbed his clubs, tossed them into the cart, and started driving like the lake behind the 18th hole was on fire. Anyone watching him must have thought he injured himself because he was moving at a speed and urgency that didn't match the calm afternoon. He didn't even change his shoes. He drove straight to his car, still in golf cleats and a polo shirt damp with sweat, and sped toward downtown Chicago with the kind of panic only a father feels when he knows something has gone terribly wrong, but doesn't yet know how bad it is. Meanwhile, back at headquarters, the building had slipped into a very specific kind of silence. The kind that happens when everyone senses something large and unseen is descending. Assistants were typing faster, HR was whispering behind closed doors, operations was pretending to stay busy but watching executives instead of spreadsheets. Even the warehouse managers, usually focused on trucks, pallets, and schedules, were texting each other asking if somebody important had died. Because in a company this size, when the executives stop making noise, it means someone is losing their job or losing their mind. Upstairs, legal was preparing for impact. They had printed every document I sent, including the activation letter with its pristine timestamps and unambiguous language. They had verified signatures. They had called external counsel. They had pulled the bylaws, the equity ledger, the compliance records, and the termination memo that set this entire disaster in motion. And the more they read, the quieter the room became. One attorney pointed out the timestamp that proved my activation letter was submitted before Junior fired me. Another pointed out the clause stating that any non-equity executive initiating termination of a founding member triggers automatic suspension of all interim authority. A third whispered that the clause was irreversible once filed, and the general counsel, after reading the final page, leaned back and pressed his palms to his forehead like someone bracing for a car crash they could see coming but could not stop. By the time Bradley Sr. burst through the glass doors of the lobby, still wearing his golf shoes, the receptionist had already been instructed to call upstairs. He didn't wait for the elevator. He walked past the security desk, past the framed mission statement he had written 26 years ago, past the large lobby display showing Anchor Point's global operations, and headed straight for the 12th floor like a man walking toward a courtroom. The elevator ride felt endless. He paced inside, fists clenching and unclenching, face reddened not from golf, but from dread. As he stepped into the hallway, every assistant stopped what they were doing. Even people who normally pretended not to notice anything recognized the weight of what was happening. His general counsel was waiting by the conference room door, with a folder so thick it might as well have been a funeral program. Inside, the board members were already gathering, some pale, some shaken, one visibly furious, all clutching their copy of the Section 12B packet like a verdict they didn't want to read. Nobody made small talk. Nobody joked. Nobody tried to smooth the tension with polite nonsense. This wasn't that kind of meeting. This was the kind where careers, legacies, and fortunes shift in a single afternoon. The general counsel didn't preface anything. He didn't lighten the blow. He simply opened the folder and read aloud the clause that changed everything. Per Section 12B of the amended shareholder agreement, any executive termination carried out by a non-equity appointee without prior board vote shall result in immediate revocation of all interim leadership authority and automatic reversion of control to the majority shareholder pending emergency review. Silence. Real silence, not confusion, not hesitation, not shock, something heavier, something closer to grief, because everyone in that room knew what majority shareholder meant. Everyone knew the number. Everyone knew whose name was on that line. And everyone knew the founder's son had stepped so far outside the bounds of his authority that there wasn't a legal broom on earth big enough to sweep it away. The founder swallowed hard and asked the only question that mattered. His voice cracked just enough to reveal the truth beneath it. Who authorized the termination of Chuck Patterson? No one spoke. He asked again, louder, more desperate. Finally, the general counsel lifted his eyes and said the words gently, but not softly, because softness would have been mercy. Your son, alone, without consultation, without authority. The founder sat down like his knees buckled. He ran both hands through his hair, staring at the table, not breathing, not blinking, just absorbing the reality that his son had detonated the one clause in the company that could not be stopped, reversed, or negotiated. He tried to protest. He insisted it was a misunderstanding. He even suggested he would retract the firing himself. That's when the general counsel delivered the second blow. There is no retracting this. The protocol is active, it is binding, and the paperwork was filed before the termination occurred. The founder's face changed in a way that only happens when a man realizes he just handed his legacy to someone who didn't understand the rules of the game. He couldn't look at the board, he couldn't look at the legal team, and for the first time in his entire career, he couldn't look at the name Patterson on the wall without feeling sick. While all of this unfolded, Junior was still upstairs in his corner office, completely unaware that his reign had already ended before it began. He was trying to call IT because he couldn't access certain executive files. He assumed it was a glitch. He assumed it was a permissions error. He assumed everyone else needed to catch up to him. He did not assume that his authority had been legally suspended before lunchtime. At 2:58 p.m., 2 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to begin, I walked into the building. Same suit, same calm, same man he'd tried to fire. Security nodded at me with a level of respect that told me someone had already briefed them on the shift in power. The receptionist pointed me to the conference room with a smile that wasn't forced or fearful, just relieved. When I opened the conference room door at exactly 3:00 p.m., every board member looked up. They weren't surprised. They weren't confused. They were waiting because they knew the man walking through the door wasn't the one who had been fired. He was the one who owned the room. As I stepped into the conference room at exactly 3 o'clock p.m., the air felt heavier than when I'd left the building earlier. Not tense like a normal meeting, tense like everyone in the room already knew the verdict and was just waiting for the executioner to tap the gavel. 8 board members sat around the polished table, papers stacked neatly in front of them, expressions pulled tight with the kind of seriousness that only appears when money, reputation, and legal exposure are all under the spotlight at once. They weren't glancing at each other. They weren't making small talk. They were staring straight ahead, waiting for me to take my seat. And not just any seat, my seat. The one at the head of the table. The one I hadn't occupied in years. The one I'd earned long before titles started getting handed out like party favors. The founder sat at the opposite end, slumped, wrinkled, drained, still wearing the golf shirt he hadn't had time to change. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years since lunchtime. His eyes were red around the edges, not from crying, but from a kind of shock that hits deeper. The shock of realizing your own child had done something irreversible. I didn't sit immediately. I placed my briefcase on the table, opened it with calm precision, and pulled out the same document that started this entire chain reaction: the motion to rescind all executive appointments made in the previous 48 hours. I set it in front of me and only then lowered myself into the chair at the head of the table. The nameplate had already been switched. Charles Patterson, majority shareholder, someone in administration, had moved fast, probably at the request of legal, probably with shaking hands, but the result was clean and impossible to ignore. My name was back where it belonged. The board chair, Harold Weinstein, cleared his throat and began the session with a formality that stiffened the entire room. This emergency meeting is now in session under Section 12B protocols. He tapped his pen once against the table, and you could almost feel the tremor ripple through the founder. Harold nodded at me. Mr. Patterson, the floor is yours. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't slam my hand on the table. I didn't lecture. I simply read the motion aloud with the steady tone of a man reciting a fact rather than making an argument. As majority shareholder of Anchor Point Logistics, I formally request a binding vote to rescind all executive appointments made in the previous 48 hours, pending full shareholder review. The words hung in the air like a bell ringing in a cathedral. Before anyone could respond, the conference room door burst open. Junior stumbled inside, face flushed, hair slightly out of place, still gripping his iPhone like a lifeline. He looked around as if he had walked into the wrong meeting by mistake. Why wasn't I informed about this? He demanded, voice pitched too high, straining for authority he didn't have. I'm the CEO. No one answered. Not the founder, not the board chair, not the legal counsel, not even the assistant who had followed him halfway and then froze at the sight of the room. He turned to me next. Chuck, he said, voice cracking just slightly. Why didn't anyone tell me what's going on? I finally looked at him. Because you don't have the authority to call or attend emergency board meetings, I said quietly. You never did. He blinked twice. This is ridiculous. I'm the CEO. The board appointed me. Harold spoke before I could reply. Your appointment was conditional and derivative. You hold zero equity stake under Section 12LB. Your termination of a founding member without board approval triggered immediate suspension of your authority. Junior stared, confused, angry, trying to form a sentence that wouldn't come. But I was just doing what needed to be done. I was taking charge. No, I said, leaning back. You were playing CEO. There's a difference. He swallowed hard, panic rising. Dad, are you really going to let them do this? Every eye turned toward the founder. He looked at his son with the pain of a man forced to choose between blood and survival. Son, you shouldn't have done this. But I was trying to help. This is bigger than you, he said, cutting him off, his voice shaking. Bigger than me, bigger than family. Ugh. Junior looked around the room, searching for a single sympathetic face. He found none. Harold lifted his hand, all in favor of rescinding the executive appointment of Bradley Patterson Jr. effective immediately. Hands went up, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and after a long, agonizing pause, the founder lifted his as the 8th and final vote. Harold nodded. Motion passes. The executive appointment is rescinded. Junior looked like someone had punched the air out of his lungs. Then he turned toward me, eyes wide with disbelief and fear. "This isn't over." "Yes," I said calmly, "it is." He turned and left, the door hitting the wall behind him before closing with a hollow thud. Security was already waiting in the hallway, not hostile, not rough, just professional, because this time his exit wasn't temporary, it was permanent. The moment the door shut, the whole room exhaled. Harold leaned back, the founder lowered his head, legal started collecting documents, and I remained where I belonged, like the head of the table. The day after the crisis settled into place, the real ripple effects began. The silent, subtle shifts that always happen after a power correction, but never make their way into press releases or board minutes. If you've ever worked in a company long enough, you know this feeling. It's not the explosion that changes things, it's the aftershock. People move differently, they speak differently, they make decisions with more caution or more confidence, depending on where they stood during the upheaval. And in this case, the building itself felt like it had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. By mid-morning, it was obvious that the leadership team was working with a renewed clarity. The head of operations walked into my office with a binder under his arm so thick it looked like a set of encyclopedias. "I've reorganized the supply chain backlog issues you mentioned," he said, laying the binder on my desk. "Here's what can be fixed in 2 weeks. Here's what needs a month. And here's what needs capital." He had never been this decisive around Junior. He had always been cautious, always over-explaining, always trying to pre-translate his expertise into corporate buzzwords that the kid might understand. But now his natural confidence was back, the kind that comes from actually knowing how the entire logistics engine works, rather than pretending to. Next came the CFO, a woman who had survived 3 CEOs, 2 external audits, a system migration, and the kind of budget crises that turn even calm people into caffeine addicts. She stepped in holding a tablet and a stack of reports. "First," she said, "I want to apologize for not flagging the leadership risk earlier. I knew he wasn't ready, but I assumed the board had their reasons." "They did," I said, "none of them good ones." She actually smirked, the kind of tired, knowing smirk accountants give when they've been right for years but were too professional to say so. "Budget forecasts are stable," she said. "Cash flow is clean. Capital expenditures are manageable. What we can't afford is another leadership disruption for at least 18 months." "We won't have one," I said. "I know," she replied, and I realized she meant it. Not politely, not optimistically, with certainty. The building trusted me. The leadership trusted me. The staff trusted me. Even the founder, wounded, humbled, but still standing, trusted me. Trust isn't loud. It's not applause or celebration. It's the quiet decision people make to follow your direction without questioning every step. Around lunchtime, word began to spread in hushed tones that Junior hadn't returned any calls, not to legal, not to HR, not to his father. He hadn't tried to barge into the building. He hadn't demanded reinstatement. He hadn't sent a lawyer's letter yet. Instead, someone spotted him leaving Chicago altogether, driving west on I-90 with the same BMW he used to proudly show off in the executive lot. The head of HR came into my office later with an update. His exit packet was delivered, she said. He's officially removed from payroll, benefits, and access. "Any severance?" I asked. She shook her head. "Termination for cause." And legal signed off on every detail. Good. Not because I wanted to punish him, but because structure matters. Titles, authority, accountability, they all mean nothing if they're not applied consistently. You don't get to fire a founding member illegally and then collect a severance check on your way out. Life doesn't work like that. Business definitely doesn't. Still, a small part of me hoped he'd land somewhere he could grow up. There's a difference between removing someone from power and wanting them to suffer. I didn't need him destroyed. I just needed him out of the driver's seat before he drove the company into a wall. After lunch, the founder walked into my office without knocking, an old habit from before everything changed. This time, though, he hesitated at the doorway. "Got a minute?" he asked. "Of course," I said. He stepped in, closed the door behind him, and sat down. He looked less exhausted today. His voice was steadier. The shock had faded and left behind something more reflective, like he'd finally spent time thinking instead of reacting. I talked to Junior this morning, he said, folding his hands in his lap. He's embarrassed, humiliated, angry, all the things you'd expect. That's normal, I said. He said he wants answers, the founder continued. He doesn't understand why the board didn't stop it, why I didn't stop it, why you didn't warn him. Because you don't warn people about rules they're supposed to know, I thought. But I didn't say that. Instead, I asked, what did you tell him? The rules are the rules, he replied, and that he broke them. That mattered more than he realized. Parents aren't supposed to hand down legal consequences, they're supposed to protect. But in a company like this, protection becomes corruption if it shields the wrong person. He leaned forward. I have a question, he said, lowering his voice, and I want an honest answer. If I had tried to block the vote yesterday, would you have removed me too? I didn't rush my response. I didn't soften it. I didn't sugarcoat it. Yes, I said. He blinked, swallowed, looked down, then nodded slowly. I thought so. That's not personal, I added. It's structural. You built a company that must survive its own founders. That includes you. That's not a weakness. It's the reason we're not bankrupt right now. A long silence stretched between us, but not an uncomfortable one. It was the silence of two men acknowledging truth without pride or resentment. I'm glad you're in that chair, he finally said, even if it took a disaster to get it right. He stood up, left the office quietly, and for the first time since the takeover, I felt the company shift from panic to acceptance. Later that afternoon, the board chair called. We've updated the external filings, he said. State records, corporate registry, shareholder database, all clean, all approved. Good, I replied. The less noise we make, the better. You're lucky you had those clauses in place, he said. Otherwise, we'd spend the next year in litigation. No, I said. You're lucky you respected my clauses when I wrote them. He laughed softly. Fair enough. When the day finally wound down, I made a point of walking the floor, not with security, not with the clipboard, just me, the old-fashioned way. Managers lifted their heads when I passed. Warehouse supervisors nodded. Drivers on break offered quick greetings. A few mid-level staff straightened a little, the way people do when they suddenly remember what leadership is supposed to feel like. Halfway through the walk, I overheard a logistics coordinator tell a new employee, that's Chuck. He's the reason all this still works. It wasn't meant for me. She didn't even know I was close enough to hear it, but the honesty in her voice landed harder than any applause or official praise ever could. That's the thing about quiet leadership. It doesn't chase recognition. It doesn't demand attention. It earns loyalty in hallways, loading docks, break rooms, and meeting tables by doing the job well enough that the people who rely on you feel safe showing up in the morning. When I reached the end of the floor, I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for 12. The doors closed slowly, the ride humming upward, and I thought about everyone who'd assumed leadership was something you could inherit. Junior believed that. His father believed it for a while. Some board members believed it too. But authority isn't inherited. Authority is practiced. Authority is proven. And the proof is always the same. When things break, who do people turn to? That night, as I walked out of the building with the sunset hitting the windows, I realized something important, something no board meeting or legal clause could articulate. The company wasn't following me because I had the title. The company was following me because I was already leading. Titles catch up after the fact. And Junior learned that too late. There is a moment after a storm where everything looks strangely sharp. Colors seem clearer, edges stand out more, and you notice things you had been walking past for years without seeing. That is what the next week felt like inside Anchor Point. It was the same building, the same furniture, the same logo on the wall, but people were suddenly paying attention to things they had accepted as background noise before. Middle management, for example, started rethinking how they handled directives. Before, when a new CEO arrived with a famous last name and a bright new title, A lot of people defaulted to compliance. They nodded along to every phrase about innovation and change because they assumed the title gave those words authority. Now, after watching a CEO lose his entire role in a single afternoon because he did not understand the rule book, those same managers looked at leadership through a different lens. The head of distribution pulled me aside in the hallway one morning. He had been with the company for almost as long as I had, quiet, practical, obsessed with truck schedules and on time metrics. I want to say something, he told me, shifting his weight like a man who was not used to speaking on anything outside of his department. Yesterday, I told my team something I probably should have said years ago. I told them that from now on, we do not chase personality at the top, we chase structure. If a decision makes no sense and does not line up with how this place actually works, we question it. Not in a disrespectful way, in a responsible way. I nodded good. I said, that is how a company stays alive. Because that is the truth most people do not like to admit. Companies do not collapse overnight because of one bad meeting or one bad quarter. They collapse slowly under the weight of decisions nobody questioned because they did not want to look disloyal. They collapse under the hands of leaders who were never challenged, never held against the standard of the system they were supposed to protect. Later that week, HR hosted a private session with upper management to walk them through what had happened without dressing it up in corporate language. I did not attend. I did not need to. I had already seen the real version. But afterwards, the HR director came to my office and said, you know what the biggest question was? Not about equity, not about bylaws, not even about Section 12B. It was this. How do we make sure we never get blindsided like that again? That is the right question. I said the wrong one would have been, how do we make sure nobody ever writes another clause like that? She smiled slightly. You are not popular with people who like shortcuts. I do not design companies for people who like shortcuts, I replied. And here is where I shift gears, not just for them, but for you. Because if you are watching this, there is a decent chance you are not a CEO, not a majority shareholder, maybe not even in management. You might be on the warehouse floor or in customer support or in a mid-level operational role that the corporate world likes to pretend is replaceable. You might be working under someone who got their title because of their last name, their degree, or their connections instead of their competence. So let me tell you something that most people at the top will never say out loud. Unearned authority is always a liability. Sometimes a slow one, sometimes a very expensive one, and sometimes a catastrophic one. Junior did not fail because he was young. He did not fail because he had an MBA. He did not fail because he wanted change. Those things are not sins. He failed because he mistook symbolic power for real authority. He thought the role made him untouchable. He believed he could override structure with ego. He thought the script in his hand mattered more than the signatures in the archive. That is where he died, professionally speaking. And this is where the lesson applies to you, whether you sit in a cubicle, a truck, a front desk, or a board chair. If the company you work for does not have clear, written, enforceable structures that outlive individual personalities, you are not working in a business, you are working in a casino. If the only thing standing between stability and chaos is who feels powerful this week, then you are not in a career, you are in a gamble. That is why I spent years trading bonuses for equity, years trading titles for clauses, years trading applause for position inside the paperwork. Because I never wanted my livelihood or anyone else's to depend on whether the CEO woke up in a good mood. You know what else surprised people that week? How quietly everything moved forward without Junior. There was no missing piece in operations, no crisis in sales, no gap in planning. The only thing missing was the anxiety that came with everyone feeling like they needed to impress the new guy. People stopped performing and went back to producing. They stopped trying to guess what would earn them points and returned to doing what made the company money. One afternoon, the investor representative and I sat in the conference room, going over long-term roadmaps. He pointed to a chart showing projected growth versus risk profiles under different leadership models. You know what the market hates most? He asked. Noise, I guessed. Close, he said. Unpredictability. The market can handle bad news, it cannot handle chaos. It applies inside the walls, too, I told him. Employees can handle tough quarters. They cannot handle waking up every morning wondering if someone unqualified is going to make a wild decision that puts their mortgage at risk. He looked at me for a second and said, if more founders understood that, we would not have to spend so much time cleaning up after their children. He was not wrong. If you are in corporate life and you have made it this far into the story, I want you to do something for yourself after this video. Not for me, for you. Look around your company and ask yourself 3 questions, quietly, honestly, without emotion. 1, who really holds authority here? Not on the org chart, in reality. Who makes calls that stick? 2, what structure backs that authority up? Equity, contracts, bylaws, or just charisma and fear? 3, if someone unqualified tried to pull what Junior pulled, is there any protection in place for the rest of you? The answer to the last one is no, then at least you will know the truth about the ground you are standing on. And if this whole thing feels a little too familiar, if you have had your job jerked around by somebody who inherited their position and decided experience was optional, I want you to do one simple thing in the comments so I know you made it to this point. Type Section 12B, not because your company has one, but because you probably wish it did. And while you're at it, if you want more stories like this from behind those glass doors that never show up in the official company newsletter, hit subscribe and tap the like button. It costs you nothing, but on our side, it tells the algorithm that regular people actually want to hear what really happens when nepotism crashes into reality. Now, we're not done yet. Because everything I have told you so far happened inside boardrooms, offices, legal departments, and private calls. But the part that still sticks with me the most did not happen in a conference room. It happened on a screen. A few weeks before all of this, I sat in on a Zoom call that should have been routine. The CEO's son, day 1 in the big chair. Me, Chuck Patterson, watching from a square in the corner of the screen, already knowing what he did not. That titles are temporary, structures are not. And the story he thought he was about to tell about his new vision was already being rewritten in the fine print. We will get to that call because that is where you really see who understands power and who is just borrowing it. If you want to understand why everything that happened later was inevitable, why the boardroom vote wasn't a shock but a delayed outcome, you have to go back to a single Zoom call. Nothing dramatic happened on that call. No shouts, no firings, no confrontations, but it revealed more about Junior's weakness than any violation of policy ever could. It was the first time he tried to act like the CEO and the first time everyone realized he wasn't built for the job. I logged in early because decades of responsibility trained you to show up before everyone else. One by one, the squares appeared: operations, HR, finance, logistics, people adjusting headsets, sipping coffee, pretending to review notes. And then he joined. 2 minutes late, camera on, smile wide, posture loose, no apology, no acknowledgement, just, all right, let's get started. As if he had been running those meetings for years rather than seconds. His assistant had appeared before he did, which is always telling. Assistants reveal the truth about a leader long before the leader ever speaks. Her posture was tense, her smile tight, her eyes flicking across the screen as if she was preparing for impact. That's the giveaway. Real leaders make their assistants' lives easier. Pretenders make their assistants carry the weight of their inexperience. When Junior finally joined, she visibly exhaled, like she'd been holding her breath. That was the first sign something was off. The second came when he assumed control without checking the room, greeting anyone, or acknowledging the people who had decades more experience than he did. Pretenders grab the microphone first. Leaders earn silence before they speak. And then he launched into a story about Stanford. Not about logistics, not about freight, not about anything useful. Instead, he talked about blockchain disruptions, case studies about Amazon, machine learning tools he didn't understand, and breakthrough frameworks he read online. People like him use vocabulary as camouflage. They hide behind buzzwords because real operational facts expose them. The CFO muted her mic and lowered her eyes. She looked like she was taking notes, but later I learned she was texting legal. Operations stared directly into the camera with the blank expression of a man imagining how fast a new CEO could break a working system. Then he dropped the phrase that told me everything I needed to know. He said the company needed to eliminate outdated thinking with the kind of confidence only someone inexperienced can muster. He didn't look at me when he said it, but he didn't have to. Every person on that call shifted their eyes toward my square. He didn't understand that experience is not outdated, stability is not outdated. Knowing how freight moves in different seasons, why certain clients behave the way they do, and what warehouse traffic looks like during peak hours, none of that is outdated. That's the backbone of the business. When someone new steps into a role and immediately labels the people who built the company as obstacles, that person isn't ready. They're dangerous. He thought he was identifying a problem. In reality, he exposed himself as the biggest one in the room. He shared a slide deck next, and it was a disaster. Bright colors, vague phrases, no metrics, no timelines, no logic. It was the kind of deck someone makes when they've memorized business jargon, but don't understand how to turn those words into action. Embrace transformation, lean into innovation, reimagine legacy frameworks. It looked like a pitch for a startup trying to sell a dream rather than a logistics company trying to move freight. The operations director muted his camera just to hide his expression. HR smiled politely but painfully. Finance stared at her desk like she was calculating the cost of recovering from this call. Then he took a shot at me. He said he wanted to streamline the company by reducing legacy influence. He didn't have the courage to say my name, but he didn't need to. Everyone knew exactly who he meant. It was an attempt to show dominance, but all it did was reveal insecurity. People who are confident don't poke at the strongest person in the room. Only insecure leaders do that because they think diminishing someone else's value will inflate their own. Never does. It just shows everyone watching that you're afraid. He doubled down. I know some people aren't used to this level of change, he said, smiling like he was teaching children a lesson. That's when the temperature on the call completely changed. He wasn't just inexperienced, he was condescending. Instead of asking questions, he lectured. Instead of trying to understand the system, he announced how he would fix it. Instead of learning the rhythm of the company, he tried to rewrite it after 15 minutes. As he spoke, the leadership team went still in a way that wasn't about respect. It was disbelief. HR muted herself to hide her reaction. Operations looked away from the camera. Legal opened a file. Yes, I saw it. The CFO stopped blinking in that way people do when they've hit their capacity for nonsense. Every person on the call recognized the same truth at the same time. He wasn't capable of leading the company he inherited, not because he lacked intelligence, because he lacked humility, because he lacked discipline, because he mistook a borrowed title for earned authority. And that's the thing, inexperienced leaders never understand. Authority isn't in the presentation. It's in the details. It's in the scars. It's in the numbers. Authority is in knowing how many trucks you can dispatch before you break your drivers. It's in knowing which client can handle a delivery window adjustment and which one will walk. It's in knowing how weather patterns affect freight flow during the holiday season. It's in knowing what to do when a shipment gets held at the port. This job doesn't reward confidence, it rewards competence. The call ended the same way a bad movie ends, abruptly, awkwardly, without applause. People clicked leave meeting faster than they typed a single message in the chat. 10 minutes later, the CFO sent me a text that read, "Please tell me I'm not the only one concerned." I responded with the truth, "You're not wrong." And that was the moment I knew the legal structure I built 13 years ago wasn't just smart, it was necessary. He thought that Zoom call made him look visionary. He thought it proved he was ready to lead. He thought the degree on his wall carried the same weight as experience. In reality, that call didn't make him a leader. It made him a liability. And liabilities don't last long at the top. He didn't lose the company in the boardroom. He lost it right here on a Monday morning call where he exposed the difference between having a title, and being able to carry one. The thing about moments like that vote is that people expect some kind of dramatic climax, like somebody shouting, somebody flipping a table, someone storming out with threats hanging in the air. But real corporate executions don't look like movies. They look like what happened in that conference room after the door closed behind Junior. The room didn't erupt, it deflated. The tension didn't explode, it leaked out slowly, like air from a tire that's been running too hard for too long. Harold closed the file in front of him with the soft thud that somehow sounded final. The legal team started stacking documents, their movements careful and deliberate, like people handling evidence after a trial. The investor representative glanced at the founder, then at me, clearly relieved that someone who understood the mechanics of the company was back in control, but smart enough not to say it out loud. The founder sat very still, shoulders slightly hunched, fingers pressed against his forehead. The man who had once walked these halls like he owned the sky above them now looked like someone who just watched his own name fracture across the glass. He didn't look at me right away. He didn't look at anyone. He was still trying to reconcile two conflicting realities in his mind, the company he built and the son he'd tried to hand it to. Harold cleared his throat gently, breaking the silence. "We still have remaining matters under Section 12B," he said, turning toward me. "We need to formally address leadership structure going forward." I knew what he was really saying. The company could not afford a vacuum. Not now, not after this, not with investors watching, clients waiting, and staff sensing instability like blood in the water. I straightened in my chair, not to dramatize it, but because this part mattered. "My recommendation," I said, "is stability first. No sudden public moves, no dramatic announcements, no heads rolling. We contain this, we steady the ship, and then we rebuild properly. That starts with one clear change. I assume the role of chairman and CEO permanently." There was no shock in the room. If anything, there was relief. The investor representative nodded almost immediately. "From a shareholder perspective, that aligns with equity structure and minimizes disruption." The head of operations spoke next. "From an internal standpoint, the staff already treat you like you're running the company. This just makes it official." Even Harold, who tended to avoid taking sides, gave a small, resigned nod. "It's the logical move," he said, "and under Section 12B, it's fully supported." The founder finally lifted his head and looked straight at me. There was no anger there anymore, just exhaustion and a kind of rough respect. "We both know this is your company," he said quietly. "It has been for a long time. I just didn't want to admit it." I didn't smile. This wasn't a moment for victory laps. "You built it," I replied. "I kept it from falling apart. Both things can be true." He let out a long breath, something between a sigh and a surrender. "So where does that leave me?" "Right where you should be," I said. "President. Focus on relationships, clients, partners, industry connections. The face of the company, not the hands on the controls. This company still needs your name. It just doesn't need your son in the driver's seat." He closed his eyes for a moment, then nodded once. "Fine," he said. "We'll do it your way." Harold picked up his pen again. "All in favor of appointing Charles Patterson as chairman and chief executive officer with immediate effect?" Hands went up around the table. There was no hesitation this time, no slow, reluctant lifts, no conflicted glances. It was a clean vote, predictable. I could have written it in advance. When Harold said motion passes, nothing in me jumped or flared or spiked. It didn't feel like winning a prize. It felt like signing for a delivery I'd ordered years earlier. The meeting moved into formalities after that. Bylaws referenced, minutes recorded, signatures requested. Legal went through the motions with the clinical efficiency of surgeons closing a successful procedure. They knew the patient was going to live. Now they were just stitching up. When the session adjourned, people stood slowly. There were no handshakes at first, just quiet nods and the shuffling of papers. Eventually, the investor representative approached me and extended his hand. "Congratulations," he said, but his tone was different from the usual corporate congratulations. Less performance, more recognition. "You just saved us from a very expensive disaster." "I just enforced what we all agreed to years ago," I said. "The clause didn't come out of nowhere. It was there for a reason. Everyone signed it." He smiled faintly. "That's exactly why we're still here." The founder approached next. This was the only interaction in the room that actually mattered to me on a human level. He stopped in front of me, hands in his pockets, shoulders still heavy under the weight of what had just happened. You could have destroyed us, he said quietly. You could have gone scorched earth, sued the board, leaked this to the press, walked away with a settlement, and let the rest of us burn. I didn't build 28 years of my life to burn it for satisfaction, I replied. I built it so it would survive moments like this. He studied my face for a long second, then nodded. For whatever it's worth, he said, voice low, I'm glad you were the one who wrote that clause. And I'm sorry about what my son did. You gave him a title, I said. The rest he did to himself. He didn't argue. He just stepped back, shook my hand once, and left the room with the slow, heavy walk of a man who had finally accepted that protecting his company no longer meant protecting his family from consequences. By 4:30 p.m., I was back in my office. Not a new office, not an upgraded office, not some flashy corner suite dreamed up by a design consultant. My office. The one I'd occupied for 15 years before someone decided innovation space and open collaboration mattered more than the guy who kept the trucks running on time. The nameplate had already been put back on the door: Charles Patterson, Chairman and CEO. There was something deeply satisfying in that small piece of metal, not because it made me feel powerful, but because it reflected reality again. The title finally matched the work I'd been doing quietly for years. I stepped inside and just stood there for a moment, taking it in. The desk was the same, the view was the same, the photos on the shelf, the stack of reports and the credenza, even the dent on the filing cabinet from when someone bumped a dolly into it during a remodel. None of it had changed, but the air felt different, lighter, clearer, honest. Downstairs, security was walking Junior to his car. They didn't drag him. They didn't humiliate him. They did their jobs, escorting an unauthorized executive from a building he no longer had any legal right to command. His BMW was parked where it didn't belong, in one of the reserved spots near the entrance, in a space intended for founders and long-term executives, not heirs playing pretend. That, more than anything, summed up the whole problem. He'd parked in a space he hadn't earned. Now he was leaving one he'd never really owned. A few employees watched from a distance, pretending not to. They saw him hand over his badge. They saw him stand there for a second like he couldn't quite believe what was happening. They saw him get into the car without slamming the door, as if even the anger had been punched out of him. Nobody clapped, nobody cheered. Real companies don't cheer when blood is on the floor. They just quietly adjust and go back to work because shipments still need to go out, trucks still need to roll, invoices still need to be processed. Inside the building, things stabilized faster than you might expect. There was no dramatic all-staff memo with corporate euphemisms about leadership transitions and evolving strategic direction. Not that day, not the day after. The people who needed to know knew. The people who didn't, they just felt the pressure ease. Drivers kept their routes, warehouse teams kept their shifts, dispatchers kept their screens up, contracts kept renewing, clients kept getting what they were paying for, the machine kept moving. The only real change was that decisions were once again flowing through someone who knew how everything actually worked. No pitch decks, no buzzwords, no pretend transformation strategies, just logistics. Sometimes power looks like a big announcement, a shiny new title, a ribbon-cutting event with catered food and inspirational speech. Other times, power looks like this: the person who's been running things all along, quietly signing a few documents, stepping back into the chair they never truly left, and going back to work. I sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and pulled up 3 dashboards: operations, finances, and client retention. These were the only ones that really mattered. While others had spent years obsessing over branding and slogans, I had always come back to the same questions. Are we moving freight efficiently? Are we profitable? Are our clients staying or leaving? The numbers told a story far more honest than any linked post. We were stable, we were healthy, we had margin, we had growth potential. What we couldn't afford was chaos. At the top, there was a knock at my door. This was the head of HR, the same woman who had stood behind Junior during my so-called termination earlier, like she was watching a bomb defusal. She looked calmer now, still tense around the eyes, but grounded. Can I come in? She asked. Of course, I said. Close the door. She stepped inside and set a folder on my desk. We've updated the records, she said. Termination for cause has been processed for Bradley. We followed legal's guidance to the letter. I nodded. Any blowback from staff? She shook her head. Honestly, most people just look relieved. They were nervous the minute he showed up with that badge. The firing this morning scared them. What happened this afternoon reset the mood. That's what I wanted, I said. Not revenge, not theatrics, just stability. She looked at me for a moment, then asked the question that had been hanging in the air since the morning. How long have you had that clause in place? 13 years, I replied. Her eyes widened, and then, to her credit, she laughed once, softly. You play a very long game, Mr. Patterson. I don't play, I said. I prepare. She smiled, shook her head in disbelief, and left with a little more ease in her shoulders. When the door closed, I leaned back in my chair and let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding since the moment Junior walked into my office with his termination script. Sometimes people think justice is loud, confrontations in hallways, shouting matches, messy lawsuits. But the cleanest version of justice in corporate life doesn't need volume. It needs paperwork. It needs patience. It needs someone willing to think in years instead of days. Sometimes the person you try to remove is the only reason the building is still standing. And sometimes letting unearned power run unchecked isn't just foolish, it's dangerous. The company was safe. The board was stabilized. The founder had been forced to face the truth. And the heir had learned the hard way that the last person you try to fire is the one who built the ground you're walking on. The next morning felt different before I'd even walked into the building. There are days in corporate life that mark themselves without permission, the way a storm leaves the air feeling charged even after the sky clears, and this was one of those days. The sun was out, the traffic was the same, people were pulling into the parking garage like always, but there was an undercurrent, something sharper, steadier, cleaner, the kind of quiet that follows a necessary purge. I swiped my badge at the entrance and the guard nodded with the kind of acknowledgement people give to someone they underestimated until yesterday. Respect, unspoken but unmistakable. Not fear, not hierarchy, recognition. The kind that comes when people see clearly for the first time who's actually been holding the building together. Inside, the receptionist didn't look tense. She wasn't avoiding eye contact the way she had during the chaos. She greeted me with something simple and sincere. Good morning, Mr. Patterson. Conference room A is prepped for you. Not rehearsed, not corporate, just honest. As I walked through the lobby, employees didn't stare, but they watched in the way animals watch the return of a familiar alpha, the silent, instinctive acknowledgement of order restored. A few people nodded, a few straightened their posture, a few smiled like a weight had been lifted from their shoulders. Stability is a strange currency in corporate life. You don't feel its value until it's missing. I walked toward the elevator and noticed something subtle. Conversation stopped when I passed, but not out of fear. People weren't afraid I would overhear something wrong. They were pausing because they trusted whatever direction the next hours would take. You can't buy that kind of response. You can only earn it one decision at a time over years of being the person who fixes problems instead of creating them. Upstairs, the 12th floor felt like a room aired out after a long time closed. Doors were open. People were moving with purpose again. The usual morning tension, coffee-fueled, rushing, back-to-back meetings, passive-aggressive emails was replaced by something more deliberate. Colleagues weren't whispering. They weren't glancing at the CEO's office like they had the day before. They weren't waiting for an unpredictable order or a sudden firing. Chaos had been replaced by clarity. I stepped into my office, closed the door behind me, and took a moment to let the room settle around me. The desk felt like an extension of my hands again. The chair felt familiar, broken in, shaped by years of decisions made early in the morning before anyone else showed up. I set down my briefcase and just stood for a moment, listening to the hum of the building waking up. Eventually, I called the founder. He answered on the second ring, voice low, tired, and the way a man sounds after losing something he didn't want to admit was already slipping through his fingers. Morning, he said, no ceremony, no defensiveness. Morning, I replied. You at home? Yeah, he said with a long exhale. Didn't sleep much. I figure, I told him. Come in around 10, we'll talk. Another pause. Is this a reprimand? No, I said, it's a reset. He was quiet for a moment. Then, all right, I'll see you at 10. When I hung up, I realized how quickly roles had shifted, not out of aggression, not out of ego, but because the company needed a steady hand and everyone knew exactly whose hand that was. Sometimes leadership doesn't announce itself. Sometimes it steps in quietly, like a surgeon taking over in the middle of a failing procedure. Not loud, not flashy, just necessary. An hour later, the founder walked into my office. No golf cleats today. No hurried panic. Just a man facing the consequences of a decision he had avoided for too long. I could see the weight in the slump of his shoulders and the faint redness around his eyes. He lowered himself into the chair across from me, not as the founder now, but as someone trying to understand how everything spiraled so quickly. He looked around my office the way people look at places they haven't been in a long time, recognizing something they once took for granted. Feels like the company again, he said quietly. It should, I replied. It always did when the right people were running it. He rubbed his hands together, palms dragging against each other like he was trying to scrape off guilt. You know, he started, voice uneven. I always thought giving Junior more responsibility was the way to prepare him. I thought exposure would make him grow faster. It doesn't work that way, I said. Pressure doesn't create diamonds, it exposes cracks. He looked up at me then, really looked, and I could see something shift in his expression, the exact moment his denial gave way to acceptance. You're right, he said. I didn't want to see it. I kept hoping he would rise to it. I kept pretending he had what it takes. But yesterday, I saw what you've probably seen for years. I wasn't trying to undermine him, I said. I wasn't waiting to take over. I was waiting for someone to handle the responsibility. And he wasn't that someone, he finished quietly. No, I said, he wasn't. He let out a long breath and leaned back. Thank you, he said, and his voice cracked for the second time in 24 hours. Not for what you did yesterday, for what you've done for nearly 30 years. I should have admitted it sooner. You did admit it, I said, yesterday, and that was the moment that saved this company. He nodded slowly, absorbing the truth without fighting it. A kind of peace settled between us. Not a warm peace, not the sentimental kind, but a professional equilibrium that only forms when two people understand exactly what roles they're meant to play. We spent the next hour reviewing operations, leadership gaps, critical projects, client risks, everything Junior hadn't bothered to understand. The founder listened, took notes, asked questions the way he used to in the early days when he was curious instead of defensive. It reminded me of the man he'd been before ego and legacy clouded his judgment. Before he left, he paused at the doorway. One more thing, he said. You were right about the equity. In what way? Is the only reason we're still here. He walked out without waiting for a response. By noon, I called a leadership team meeting. HR, legal, operations, finance, logistics, no big presentation, no long speeches, just clear instructions delivered in the straightforward tone of someone who wasn't interested in theatrics. Here's what we're not doing: panicking, gossiping, or making sudden announcements. Here's what we are doing: stabilizing operations, reviewing contracts, ensuring our teams know their jobs are safe, and preparing a quiet internal memo about leadership structure. I'll handle the board, HR will handle communication, legal will handle compliance. Everyone nodded, not one person objected or suggested a different approach. The room felt synchronized for the first time in months. When a company has been operating under fear or confusion, clarity feels like oxygen. By the afternoon, productivity had shot back up. Emails were shorter, direction was clearer, departments were aligned, people weren't walking on eggshells, they were walking with purpose. At 4 o'clock p.m., one of the warehouse supervisors sent me a message. Good to have you back. 6 words, no fluff. Exactly the kind of acknowledgement that matters coming from the people who actually keep the trucks moving. That night, when I sat alone in my office after everyone had gone home, I realized something important. The company hadn't been saved yesterday, it had been revealed. The truth had always been the same. I'd been running this place for years. Yesterday simply forced everyone else to catch up. And that, more than anything, was why everything felt stable again.